Chris Stephens.
Thank you, Ms Noakes. I was surprised to be so early to be called in this debate because I was expecting finally to hear some sort of philosophical introduction, some sort of support from the government backbenchers. But of course, as we've seen throughout the whole Commons process in relation to this bill, it's usual that government ministers government supporters, government backbenchers walk out and they have their own industrial action. Without a ballot, I would hasten to add, Ms Noakes, unlike the trade union movement. But I thought we would have some government backbencher with some sort of philosophical introduction, some sort of ethos to try and bind the minimum strikes level bill and this code of practice together. But I'm so disappointed that that's not taking place, Ms Noakes. But my first question has to go to the Minister is, and it was incredible, what not just what he said to me, but even more incredible what he said to my good friend, the Honourable Member for Glasgow East. He firstly said there was no requirement for guidance for employers, and then after another intervention, I think it was from the member from York Central, he said that there would be guidance, but it wouldn't be statutory guidance. Now, this is absolutely, completely and utterly ridiculous, because usually the government, if they were even-handed, Ms Noakes, would have two statutory instruments together, one for trade unions and one for employers, so that everybody is clear. But we know what the game is about here, is that to allow employers to use this legislation to bust industrial action. And they know that the game is up. But what I would ask the Minister is, what is it about workers having decent wages that the government are so repelled by? Why are they so repelled by workers standing up for good terms and conditions, having those wages to support their families? Is it because if we had consistent Conservative Party rule from the 1800s, we would still have children going up chimneys? Or is it from the 1990s, of course? We all remember it was the Conservative Party who bitterly opposed the original minimum wage legislation after an acrimonious debate. And I'll give way to the member for Islington.
Can I bring him slightly more up to date? Could he cast his mind back to the 1970s when there was industrial relations legislation introduced by the Heath government, which ended up with 5 dockers being put in prison, who were then released because it was a headlong clash with the trade union movement and it resulted in mass strikes all over the country?
Well, the honourable gentleman is of course correct, and the reason that the Conservative Party have never forgave the trade union movement for defeating the Heath government in the 70s, and they still remember. But of course, as my honourable friend from Glasgow East said, you know, they haven't legislated under any of this for government ministers when they decided to go on strike without a ballot. Of course, Ms Noakes, let's remember when they all walked out together. And that was inconveniencing the public, wasn't it? Oh, I certainly will give way to the Minister.
I just wanted to point out the difference between somebody going on strike and somebody resigning. You might not understand the difference in those things. There's no restriction in here or anywhere else that stops somebody from resigning, which is what those government ministers did.
Well, I think you'll find, Minister, it was coordinated action. That it was coordinated action. Well, I think you'll find it was coordinated action, and I think you'll also find there was no ballot required, unlike the trade union movement. I'm now going to come to well, they're now denying they went to strike, so this is interesting, but I'll give way to more.
Honourable friend will of course be aware that it was actually worse than that, because what many of those ministers were doing was practising fire and rehire, because they resigned and they were actually reinstated, many of them, to their previous jobs, thinking for example of the honourable gentleman, the member for Hexham. So perhaps the Minister might be just a little bit out of touch with what was going on at that point.
Well, I think that unfortunately, I think the Minister sometimes, and I say this charitably, sometimes I've always found in the debates I've had with the Minister as good-natured as he can be, but he is often accused by me and others of not understanding what actually takes place in an organised workplace. But I think it was quite clear that government ministers organised collectively to leave their post, which caused huge inconvenience to the public. But I don't see a minimum service level delegated legislation for government ministers to address that particular point. And of course I'll give way.
Because the public couldn't tell the difference between when they were in office and when they resigned.
Well, that may be the case. That may very well be the case. I think the honourable member makes an eloquent point, and I think the member for York Central wanted to intervene.
grateful when the honourable members talk about minimum service levels. Of course, every single day this government are in office, they're not able to maintain those minimum service levels across a vast array of our public services. So why does he think they're requiring more workers to attend work on strike days than the rest of the year?
That is a magnificent point, I have to say, that's made by the member for York Central, and this has been debated on various occasions in which we have asked the government, perhaps the Minister will rise to his feet. I'll take his intervention right now as to why is it necessary for minimum service levels on industrial action days, but there is no minimum service levels at any other time. Because if there was a statutory guidance and code of practice for employers, we would certainly ask the question, would it not be better, would employers ask, and they do, demand that there's more workers in work on days of industrial action and on shift in days of industrial action than there are when people are not in industrial action and on a normal working day. And the Minister knows this because it's been raised consistently that employers are always at it when they discuss these things. And I can tell him as someone who was a trade union activist and very proud to be so, and I should refer to my register of members' interest as well, Ms Noakes, as a proud member of the Glasgow City branch of Unison, that when we were negotiating these things on strike days, we had to negotiate life and limb cover, which, yes, is covered in legislation, that there has to be a service for life and limb cover, that employers would ask for more people on shift on days of industrial action than on days when there was a normal working day. And perhaps the Minister, I'll take his intervention right now, can give us an assurance that he will ensure that no employer across these islands will ask for more workers to be at work on days of industrial action than there are on normal working days. Minister, I'm more than happy to take your intervention right now, and I note for the record that the Minister has not risen to his feet. But we know that since the passage of the Anti-Strike Act, suggestions that the Act's provisions on minimum service levels would be similar to the norms of Europe. Well, no, they're not. I won't repeat all of the clarifications which I and others have offered on what actually happens in Europe, as those fell on deaf ears. I will, however, Ms Knox, repeat our warnings that this nasty legislation will prove to be severely counterproductive and damaging overall to society, taking a negotiated, voluntary and successful approach to minimum service levels and mutating it into an imposed, coercive and ultimately failed system is, I have to say, very foolish, but of course unsurprising from those who choose not to listen or learn. So let me comment in detail in one particular sector, the health sector, and I'll do so by referring extensively to the TUC's consultation response on the minimum service levels for hospital services, and later I'll refer to the views of the British Medical Association and the Royal College of Nursing. The TUC believe that this Act is unfair, undemocratic and like to be in breach of our international legal commitments. It is their view that it is a fundamental right of a worker to take industrial action to defend their pay and conditions, that Secretaries of State have been given enormous power to define and introduce minimum service requirements. It is draconian in that it could lead to individual workers being sacked for taking part in industrial action that was supported in a democratic process, with trade unions facing large damages if deemed to be non-compliant with this code of practice. And perhaps the Minister, as he was challenged by the Shadow Minister, can answer the question, because the Minister was quoted as saying that no one would be dismissed as a result of this legislation, where that is. The Act has always been unnecessary because of the customary practice of life and limb, and it would actually be counterproductive. But then that's not just the view of the TUC. The government's own impact assessment suggests that industrial disputes are likely to become more protracted and prolonged as a result of introducing minimum service levels. In summary, the TUC believe that this approach is unacceptable, anti-democratic, draconian and ultimately both unnecessary and counterproductive. But given the purpose of this DL committee, a further comment from the TUC may well prove to be the undoing of the code of practice itself, which is, given the fact that the services subject to minimum service levels are to be determined by secondary legislation, there remains a number of uncertainties around the extent to which the policy would restrict the right to strike, the relationship between the ability to strike and the strength of workers' ability to bargain on terms and conditions of employment through collective bargaining, and C, the value placed on collective bargaining relating to terms and conditions of employment. And those comments, Ms Noakes, were derived from the government's own impact assessment. Of course, Conservative members could simply choose to disregard the findings of such an impact assessment, and they would find some interesting backers in doing so, as the government's own Regulatory Policy Committee judged the impact assessment of the Act as red-rated, not fit for purpose, and found that the government makes use of assumptions in the analysis which are not supported by evidence. And here was us thinking that Boris Johnson's days were gone. There are other, less parliamentary ways of saying that, of course, Ms Noakes. You could suggest that it makes use of assumptions which are not supported by the evidence. And I'll leave members to their own imagination in that. Now let's explore the views of the British Medical Association and the Royal College of Nursing. There is clear agreement among health sector unions, as the VMA also considers the proposals for minimum strike levels to be counterproductive, undemocratic, unworkable and draconian. It seems that this Act is little more than a smokescreen, where instead of addressing the state of the NHS, which currently compromises patient safety on a daily basis, or addressing the underlying reasons why doctors and other healthcare staff have been striking in some parts of the UK, although and not in others, the government is trying to paint healthcare workers as the villains of the piece, rather than the victims of governmental actions and inactions. I specifically mentioned striking in some part of the UK, Ms Noakes, as a different, more respectable approach to public service employees is in Scotland, and that's resulted in something closer to industrial harmony. Perhaps others should watch and learn from what the Scottish Government is achieving in public sector relations. Throughout these islands, there is a long-standing history of constructive joint working between NHS employers and trade unions at a local level that has patient safety at its heart. The introduction of minimum service levels in hospitals would poison those industrial relations. It would take a system responding to and tailored to the needs of hospital service users by those who understand local needs, and replace it with a national service level mandated from Whitehall by those who arrogantly assume that they know better. Although government consultation has seemed to find that several critical incidents were due to strike action, data from a Freedom of Information request suggests otherwise. It is unclear whether any were a direct result of the action being called, and rather than demonstrating that patient safety was compromised due to industrial action, the data shows the importance of tackling the stresses the NHS faces on a daily basis. The BMA has repeatedly raised concerns that the reasonable steps which unions would be required to comply with the Act and the guidance would force unions to act in a way that undermines their responsibility to represent their members. It is not reasonable to expect unions to take any steps that would undermine legitimate strike action for which they will have passed a high threshold to have a lawful mandate from the Trade Union Act. And of course I'll give way.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank my honourable friend who's making an expert response. I'd also like to make the committee aware and register of interest that I am a member of United Union. But what I was going to say was, does my honourable friend share my concern that by allowing employers to amend works notice up to the end of the 4th day before industrial action commences, these regulations risk allowing unscrupulous employers to create formidable and unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles for trade unions to overcome, thereby giving them the opportunity to intentionally undermine entirely legitimate and otherwise lawful strike action.
Well, I agree with all of that, because I know it will surprise some of the Conservative members, but I do believe that there are unscrupulous employers out there. And we know already that unscrupulous employers already use existing anti-trade union legislation in order to try and stop industrial action taking place, some of which on some daft minutiae, frankly, over lists of members and all of that. But the point that I was making is that trade unions already have imposed on them by this government extremely high thresholds which they have to cross before industrial action takes place. Ms Noakes, the draft code of practice does not achieve the need for clarity over what this duty will mean in practice for trade unions. Instead, it presents issues for trade unions over how they will be able to practically implement the proposals. It creates incredibly unrealistic timescales on unions, requiring them to start identifying members as soon as reasonably practical after receiving a work notice. Such weasel words threaten vindictive penalties for being unable to guess what a Conservative minister thinks is reasonable. Ms Noakes, let me refer to some surprising comments from the Royal College of Nursing. They are surprising in that they were advised that this legislation would not affect them at all. But maybe they weren't too surprised to discover that that was not the case. Ministers told nurses from the dispatch box that the strike's minimum service level bill was not about nurses. This was always flagrantly untrue, as the RNC clearly stated at the time. Specifically, the Leader of the House said on the 26th of January 2023 that the strike's minimum service levels bill was not about nurses and that it was wrong to suggest it was. Through its draft regulations for NHS ambulance services and the NHS patient transport service, the government is now explicitly seeking to impose minimum service levels that apply specifically to nursing staff and ambulance services. And the RNC asks that Parliament, including the members present here, should hold the government to its words and reject regulations that would impose minimum service levels on nursing staff. Let me conclude, I'll give way to my friend.
I thank my friend for giving way, and I, like him, I'm a member of Unison in Glasgow, but the concerns he's raised about how all of this applies to the NHS, and particularly about how it applies to nurses, have been raised with me by a number of constituents. They're incredibly concerned at the pernicious nature of this government's legislation and its actions more generally. Was he not right earlier on to say that the way to avoid strike action in the NHS and indeed across our public services is to have decent industrial relations and to invest in them properly, and indeed to welcome people into this country who are willing to supplement the workforce which is so desperately crying out for more pairs of hands?
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and I hope that the Minister will take that on board, because good industrial relations means a happy workforce. It actually means less industrial action when you have good industrial relations. So let me conclude, Ms Noakes, with some comments about Scotland, which will not surprise you or anyone in this committee. I've already referred to how a different and more respectful approach to public service employees in Scotland has resulted in greater harmony and very much fewer strikes. The RCN explicitly recognised that this imposition of the proposed code of practice on Scotland and Wales would be additionally problematic, as it would explicitly contradict the wishes of the elected devolved administration. We will look to see, Ms Noakes, if the UK Government can echo a similar respect for Scottish rights and autonomy as that shown by our trade union colleagues south of the border.